darkness inside the cave was absolute. Not the soft darkness of a clouded night, where the eyes eventually adjust and shapes resolve themselves from shadow. This was a deeper dark, the dark of the Earth's interior, the dark of places the sun had never touched and never would, the darkness of Polyphemus. Odysseus pressed himself flat against the wet stone of the cave wall and listened to the Cyclops breathe. The sound filled every corner of the cave, every hollow and fissure in the rock. A vast tidal rhythm, like the sea itself compressed into lungs. Polyphemus slept on his side, enormous and monstrous and terrible, curled among the bones of the men he had eaten over the past 2 days. Eurylochus, Antiphus, 4 others whose names Odysseus had already repeated to himself so many times in the dark that they had started to come apart, syllables losing meaning like stones worn smooth by water. He would not forget their names. He told himself this. He would not forget. In his hands he held the stake, olive wood, enormous, the point hardened in the embers of the Cyclops fire hours before. The plan was precise and terrible in its simplicity. He had sharpened it himself. He had pressed his palm against the tip until it drew blood just to be certain. Around him, the surviving men crouched in silence. Elpenor still trembling. Perimedes' jaw tight with the effort of stillness. Eurylochus's cousin Polites, who had barely spoken since they watched the Cyclops take the first 2 men and dash them against the cave floor, like birds against stone. 8 men. There had been 12. The Cyclops stirred. Every man in the cave stopped breathing. Polyphemus shifted, enormous shoulder rolling forward, and then settled again into that terrible rhythm of sleep. The fire had burned low. The cave smelled of blood and cheese and sheep's wool and something else beneath it all. Something older, something that clung to the stone itself, as though the island had its own dark scent that no wind could carry away. Odysseus moved. He crossed the floor of the cave in 13 careful steps. He would remember that number afterward, in the hours before everything went wrong. 13 steps across the cold stone floor, avoiding the bones without looking down, keeping his eyes fixed on the sleeping face of the Cyclops, on the single vast eye, closed now, its lid like a sail furled in harbour. He positioned the stake. He pressed the point gently into the embers, turning it, letting the tip catch just enough heat to remind itself what it was for. Then he looked back at his men. In the dim orange light, their faces were gaunt and terrified and trusting. He had never felt the weight of that trust as clearly as he did in that moment. He nodded. They came forward silently, 4 of them, hands finding their places along the length of the stake, the way he had drilled into them that afternoon. Here and here and here and here. And he took the forward position himself because he had always taken the forward position, because that was what it meant to be Odysseus. And together they lifted it, and together they drove it down. The scream of Polyphemus split the night open. It was not like a man's scream. It was like the sound the earth makes when it cracks along a fault. Low and vast and accompanied by a vibration that travelled up through the stone floor and into the bones of every man standing on it. The Cyclops lurched upright, enormous hands clawing at his face, at the ruined eye that wept fire and smoke, and the cave shook with the impact of his body against the walls, against the floor, against the pens where his sheep stamped and called out in their own animal panic. The men scattered. This was the plan. Scatter. Hide among the sheep. Wait. Polyphemus crashed from wall to wall, blind now, howling, the sound of him enormous and awful and everywhere at once. Odysseus pressed himself into the far corner of the cave, behind a great yew, one hand buried in her wool, and waited for the Cyclops' rage to find its edges. When the other Cyclops called from outside, "Polyphemus, what has happened? Who has hurt you?" Odysseus felt the plan fold around him like armor. "Nobody!" the Cyclops shrieked into the dark. "Nobody has hurt me. Nobody has blinded me." And the other voices fell away, retreating into the island's silence, muttering among themselves about madness and the troubles of gods, and the stone was rolled back from the cave mouth to let the sheep out to morning pasture, and Polyphemus crouched beside the opening with his hands spread wide to catch any man who tried to pass. This was the part Odysseus had anticipated. He had bound men to the bellies of the largest rams using the Cyclops' own ropes, twisted and thick as ship's cable. He found his animal in the darkness, the great black ram, enormous, the one Polyphemus clearly favoured, the one that always led the flock. He pressed himself beneath it, hands locked in wool, feet lifted from the ground. The ram was warm against him. He could hear its heart. He began to think, despite everything, that they were going to live. The sheep moved toward the mouth of the cave in their slow, milling way, and Polyphemus ran his hands over each one as they passed, checking backs and sides. He was thorough and methodical in the way that the enormous and the wounded sometimes are, channeling their hurt into careful work, and Odysseus felt each pass of the Cyclops' hands over the animals beside him with a cold, liquid dread that he kept entirely out of his breathing. Then the great ram stopped. Polyphemus had caught it, not by the back, not by the wool where a man might be hidden, but by the neck, drawing it aside the way one draws a favoured dog away from the pack for a private word. Odysseus felt the ram's weight shift. He locked his fingers tighter. The Cyclops spoke to the animal in a low voice, almost gentle, the voice of a giant who had forgotten for a moment that he was a monster. He spoke about the eye. He spoke about the pain. He asked the ram if it too had seen something, if it had smelled the stranger, felt him on his back in the night. He pressed his forehead against the animal's forehead and breathed in the scent of him. And then his hand moved down, not along the back, under. The hand closed around Odysseus's wrist. What happened in the next few seconds existed outside of time, the way certain moments do, compressed and endless and impossible to fully reconstruct afterward by anyone who survived them. Polyphemus dragged the man out from beneath the ram and lifted him. The surviving crew, already half emerged from the cave mouth into the grey morning light, heard the sound Odysseus made. Polites would spend the rest of his life trying to describe it and failing. It was not a scream. Odysseus never screamed. It was more like the sound of a man who has, in a single instant, understood something complete and terrible and final. Polyphemus held him up, held him at arm's length, turning him slowly in the pale morning light that filtered through the cave mouth, studying him with the one ruined socket and the surviving eye. And in that eye Odysseus saw, of all things, a kind of recognition. The Cyclops had known, perhaps not the exact shape of the plan, but some animal knowledge, some deep instinct that lives beneath thought, had told him, "Wait, check the ram." "Nobody," Polyphemus said slowly. Then he smiled, and the smile was worse than the rage had been. Outside, Polites was screaming something. Orders, warnings, names. Odysseus could hear him at a great distance, the way one hears voices from above the surface of water when one is already drowning. He reached for the knife at his belt. He managed to draw it. It was a good knife, bronze with a handle of carved bone, given to him by his father Laertes on the day he first went to sea. He had carried it for 20 years. In his hand now it looked like a toy, like a child's wooden sword held against the arm of a statue. He drove it into the Cyclops' thumb anyway. Polyphemus barely flinched, the eye fixed on him with something that was, unmistakably, curiosity. "Small," the Cyclops said, as though this explained everything. He brought Odysseus against the cave wall with a single motion. The stone was cold. The impact was absolute. And Odysseus, king of Ithaca, teller of stories, favourite of Athena, the man who had been called the cleverest of all mortal men, the man whose cunning had helped bring down Troy, who had outfoxed gods and kings and monsters across 10 years of war, was gone between one breath and the next. Outside, his men ran. They ran for the ships and did not stop. The 2 ships came back to the fleet of Aeolus without Odysseus and without the men who had died in the cave, and for a long time no one aboard either vessel spoke. They anchored off the island and sat in the afternoon sun, and the silence between them was a different kind of silence from any they had known before. Not the silence of men who are afraid, but the silence of men who do not know yet what they are. Polites told the story 7 times in the first 2 days. Once to the rest of the crew immediately upon returning. Once to Eurylochus, who had stayed with the ships and who received the news standing very still with his hands at his sides, and then walked to the stern of the ship and sat there alone for an hour. Once to the emissary from Aeolus, who came to find out why the wandering ships had returned. Twice more to the assembled crews in the following days, as the reality of it sank through them like cold water through cloth. Each time he told it, the story was slightly different, not because Polites was dishonest, but because memory reshapes itself around the things it cannot hold still. And the image of Odysseus at the end, small, struggling, already past saving, was not something any of them could hold still for long. What they agreed on, the plan had worked, except where it had not. The surviving men had escaped. Odysseus had not. What they could not agree on, whether there had been anything they could have done, whether Polites should have gone back, whether anyone should have gone back, whether going back would have accomplished anything except adding to the number of the dead. These questions would follow them for the rest of their lives, rising at odd moments, over fires on distant shores, in the small hours of sleepless nights, years later in the beds of wives who would never fully understand what it was they had witnessed on that island. And none of them would ever answer satisfactorily. They sailed without direction for a time. Without Odysseus, the question of where they were going became suddenly enormous, and none of them had the appetite to answer it. Eurylochus, who had always been the second in command and who had always privately believed himself the more sensible man, found that command without Odysseus was a different thing entirely. A cold, unwelcome weight, rather than the natural authority it had always seemed when someone else was carrying it. He pointed them east, toward home. There was nothing else to point them toward. The sea seemed different on the voyage back. Sailors noticed changes in the water, in its colour, its mood, the way it moves beneath a hull, the way farmers notice changes in soil. The men who survived the island of the Cyclops would speak, in later years, about how the sea felt on those homeward weeks. Heavier, they said, slower, as though something had shifted in the deep water, some great weight realigning itself far below where any light reached. Poseidon was not angry. That would have been comprehensible. The sea god's rage was a known thing, a storm anger, a reef anger, understood in its dimensions if not in its mercy. This was something different. This was satisfaction. The surviving men of Odysseus's crew reached Ithaca in fragments, by ones and twos and small groups, over the course of months. There had been more losses on the return, storms, fever, a skirmish off the coast of a hostile island, whose name Polyphemus could never afterward remember with any certainty. Of the crew that had followed Odysseus out of Ithaca's harbour, fewer than 30 made it home. Of the men who had been inside the cave, only Polyphemus and one other, a young oarsman named Camandros, survived the full journey. Penelope received them in the great hall of the palace. She was 31 years old. She had been beautiful in the way of women who are confident and clear-eyed, and she was still beautiful in that way, though something in the arrangement of her face had altered in the years of waiting. A tightening around the eyes, a quality of containment that was new. She sat in the chair that should have been Odysseus's chair, and she listened to Polyphemus tell the story of the cave, and she did not weep. Those who were watching her said afterward that she was utterly still throughout, still in the way of objects rather than people, and that what was frightening was not the stillness itself, but the moment at the end when it broke, a single sharp intake of breath, almost too small to hear. And then the stillness returned, and she thanked Polyphemus for his service, and dismissed him, and rose, and walked from the hall, and no one who was present could say what her face had looked like as she turned away, because not one of them had been willing to look. Telemachus was 9 years old. He had very little memory of his father. A pair of hands large and certain, the smell of the sea, a voice telling him something he could not recover, only the tone of it, warm and amused and engaged. He learned his father was dead from one of the serving women, who told him badly, and too quickly, because she was frightened and did not know how to carry the news carefully. He received it the way children receive the worst things, without the architecture to process them properly, and went outside and sat in the olive grove for a long time, staring at the ground, and came back in for dinner and ate in silence, and that was the last day anyone would describe Telemachus as a happy child. What spread across Greece was not the truth. The truth was too small for what it had unmade. The truth was a plan that worked except where it didn't, a hand moving at the wrong moment, a stone wall. What spread was something larger and stranger and more appropriate to the scale of what had been lost. In Argos they said Odysseus had angered Poseidon deliberately, had taunted the sea god on the voyage out, had thrown his pride into the waves like a challenge. In Corinth, they said the Cyclops was not merely a monster, but a servant of something older, something that had been waiting specifically for the man from Ithaca. In Sparta, Menelaus heard the story and went very quiet and poured wine into the earth and did not say what he was thinking, which was that he had always believed Odysseus was indestructible, and that he did not know what to do with a world that had proven him wrong. In Athens, scholars debated the cave. They drew it out on clay tablets, the dimensions they imagined, the placement of the sheep pen, the position of the fire, the angle of the cave mouth. They tried to locate the flaw in the plan. The plan had been brilliant. Most of them agreed. The plan had been the kind of thing only Odysseus could have conceived. The flaw, they concluded after much argument, was not in the plan itself, but in the space between planning and the world. That gap where even the most finely constructed design must finally meet reality, which does not care about cleverness. The Cyclops island was not visited again. Sailors who had gone near it before, drawn by rumour and the adventurer's appetite for danger, stopped going. Not all at once, gradually. One by one, as the years accumulated, captains found reasons to chart different courses, to give the island wider berth, to respond with flat silence when younger crew members asked why they didn't just look. It was not fear of the Cyclops himself exactly. Or not only that, it was more that the island had come to mean something in the imagination of sailors, had become the place where the cleverest man alive had gone and not come back. And if cleverness couldn't save you there, then nothing could. And if nothing could save you there, then the healthy response was simply not to go. She unravelled his memory slowly, the way she unravelled that shroud, steadily and at night and alone so that no one could see how much of it was already gone. The first year she still expected him, not consciously. She had believed polites. But expectation is not a conscious thing, not entirely. It lives in the body, in the habit of turning towards certain sounds, in the way sleep arranges itself around the anticipation of another person. For the first year she still woke sometimes in the small hours, reaching for a warmth that was not there. The second year she began to understand that the suitors, who had appeared at the edges of the court before as petitioners, as hopeful guests, as men with family connections and political interests, were circling now in a different way. There was Antinous, the cleverest and the most dangerous. There was Eurymachus, who was beautiful in the shallow way of men who have learned to use beauty as an argument. There were others, younger and more crass, who came later as the years compounded and the vacuum of Ithaca's kingship became more obvious and more inviting. Without Odysseus to return to, the waiting had no shape. In the original story, Penelope's faithfulness was sustained by certainty. Not certainty that he lived, but certainty of who she was, which was the wife of Odysseus. Without the constant expectation of his return to structure that certainty, it began to erode at the edges. Not her love. That remained. But the architecture around it weakened, and the suitors, who had no understanding of love but considerable understanding of weakness, felt the change and pressed. She held them off with cunning, with delays, with conditions, with a political manoeuvring that women of her era were required to conduct entirely invisibly, because the alternative was having no politics at all. She was good at it. She was her husband's equal in this. But cunning without time has limits, and time in this version of things was not her ally. The suitors moved into the palace by the 5th year, not all at once, by increments the way water moves into a cracked hull. A feast that extended past its welcome. A gift that implied reciprocity. A conversation that ended with a man still standing in the room long after he had reason to be there, and the slow, suffocating realization that asking him to leave would cost more than letting him stay one more night. By the 7th year, the great hall rang every evening with their laughter and their drinking and the particular kind of noise men make in a space they have decided to own. Penelope ate most of her meals in her rooms. Athena was not present for any of this. She had been everywhere in the time before. She had sat beside Odysseus in his planning, invisible and certain, guiding the shape of his thought the way a river guides a stone. not by force, but by constant, subtle pressure. She had loved his mind the way the gods love the things that most remind them of themselves, his quickness, his adaptability, the way he faced the impossible with something that looked from a distance remarkably like cheerfulness. She had looked away at the wrong moment. She would never be entirely certain why. Perhaps Poseidon had arranged a distraction. The sea god was patient, and his patience had its purposes. Perhaps she had simply trusted the plan too much. Perhaps she had understood, on some level she could not access directly, that what was happening in that cave was the moment where her influence ran out. Whatever the reason, she had not been there, and she did not go back. She watched the consequences unfold from the distance of Olympus with something that was not quite grief. The gods do not grieve as mortals do, but was something adjacent to it. A heaviness, an awareness of how things might have been arranged differently, and the knowledge that they were not and could not now be. She appeared to no heroes. She gave no gifts of cunning or clarity. When mortals prayed to her for guidance in matters of strategy and intelligence, she heard them. She always heard them, but she did not answer, and the prayers fell back to earth like birds with broken wings. Poseidon noticed. He did not comment. He was not a god who commented on things, but the seas around Greece grew longer in their swells, more unpredictable in their moods, more dangerous in the particular way of things that had been left without oversight. Sailors began to pray more. Prayer increased in inverse proportion to its usefulness, as it generally does. The ships stayed closer to shore. The great voyages, the tradition of reaching further, of sailing past the edge of the known to discover what the unknown contained, quietly diminished. Not banned, not forbidden, simply undertaken less, and then rarely, and then almost not at all. Greece turned inward. The island had never been magnificent. Odysseus himself had said this, had said it with the pride of a man who loved a thing precisely for its imperfections, who found in his rocky, stubborn island a reflection of himself. There is nothing worth boasting about in Ithaca. It is a rough place. It is mine. Without him the roughness remained. The minorness departed. The suitors had no investment in the island's prosperity. They ate its stores and drank its wine and held their nightly revels in its hall, and made no plans for its future because the future of Ithaca was simply not something they thought about. They were young men of family and ambition who wanted the crown because crowns were worth wanting, not because they had any particular feelings about the island that came with it. The farms produced less. The fishing boats went out less frequently. The harbour filled with fewer vessels. The old men who remembered the days of Odysseus, who remembered the years when Ithaca was known across the Aegean as the island of the cleverest king, sat in the agora in the mornings and spoke carefully, and those who passed could hear them speaking but could not quite make out the words, which were anyway mostly the same word, spoken in the register of loss. The young men grew up with the suitors in the hall. Some of them admired the suitors. Some were bought by them. Some understood them for what they were and grew cold and hard in the understanding. The island divided along this line, slowly, the way rock divides along its grain under patient pressure, and the crack between one side and the other widened with each year until neighbours who had known each other for generations stood on opposite sides of it and had no language for what had happened. He was not his father. This was the thing people said about him most often, and they said it with a register that was difficult to read. Part consolation, part apology, part observation of a plain fact. He had his mother's patience and his father's jaw, and some third quality that was entirely his own. A stillness, a quality of watchfulness, the capacity to sit in a room for a long time without calling attention to himself while noticing everything. He had read everything the palace library contained about the Trojan War. He had read the accounts of the campaigns, the records of councils, the letters that came back to Penelope over the 10 years of fighting. He had held them in his hands, these letters, the ones written in his father's hand. Economical, clear, always with a joke somewhere in them, a joke he had to hunt for, and tried to build a man out of the evidence. What he built was not quite right. He knew this. He was building from the outside, the way sculptors begin, the shape first, the interior later, hoping the process would eventually run in both directions. The interior never materialized. He had no access to it. He had only the letters and the stories that grew more elaborate with each year, and Polite's account of the cave that he had memorized at 12, and which he could still recite word for word at 17. Every word of it lying against him like a stone. The suitors found him mildly interesting in the early years. Something to tease occasionally, a way to pass an evening. As he grew older and the teasing produced no reaction worth harvesting, they found him irritating. Antinous, the worst of them, would sometimes watch Telemachus with a calculating expression that the boy understood precisely and chose not to acknowledge, because acknowledging things before the right moment was a waste of advantage. He had learned that much from the letters. At 17, Telemachus began asking sailors about the Cyclops island. He asked carefully, indirectly, in the way of his father. He would sit near the harbour in the evenings when the fishing boats came in and talk to the old men who had seen things, and steer the conversation gently toward the west, toward those waters, toward what was known or believed about the island that everyone avoided. He was methodical about it. He kept no notes because notes could be found, but he remembered everything, catalogued and cross-referenced in the precise internal library of his mind. What he gathered was not much. Polite's account confirmed and reconfirmed. The testimony of 2 separate sailors who had passed within sight of the island, not near but near enough to see the shape of it on the horizon, and both of whom agreed that there was something wrong with the light there, something they could not describe more precisely, only that it did not behave the way light was supposed to behave over open water. A trader from Corcyra who had drunk too much told him that the island was cursed now, properly cursed, not in the story way, but in the real way that old places sometimes became, soaked through with what had happened in them, until the very ground refused ordinary life. Telemachus listened to all of it. He told his mother he was going to visit Nestor in Pylos. She looked at him for a long moment with the expression she used when she already knew what she was being told was not the complete truth. And then she kissed his forehead and asked him to be careful and told him to take enough provisions, and he understood that she knew, and that she was letting him go anyway, and that this was the most frightening kind of love. He hired a small crew, 11 men, most of them the sons or nephews of his father's original sailors, chosen with care, men with something to prove but not too much to prove, men who could hold a course and hold their tongues. The voyage west was 3 weeks, and wrong weather for most of it. Not storm wrong, but The other kind, the odd still days where the air had a quality to it like held breath, and the sea moved in patterns beneath the hull that didn't correspond to any wind. On the 12th day, one of the crew, a young man named Doron, 19, the grandson of Eurylochus, came to Telemachus at the stern and said quietly that the men were talking. "About what?" Telemachus said. "Not a question. Where we're going, what it is. What do they think it is?" Doron was quiet for a moment. "They think we're going to the island." "Yes." "They're afraid." "Yes," Telemachus said again. He looked at the horizon, which was the colour of old bronze in the afternoon light. "Are you?" Doron considered this. "I think I would be less afraid if you told us what you were hoping to find there." Telemachus was quiet for a long time. Below, the hull breathed against the water. The sail filled and shifted. "My father died in a cave," he said finally. "I want to know what he thought in the last moment. I want to know if there was something he didn't see. I want to know if it was..." He stopped. The word was difficult. He said it anyway. "Inevitable. And if it was, then I'll know that, and I can stop looking." Doron went back to the crew. He told them something. Telemachus did not hear what, and the talking stopped. Not because they had stopped being afraid, but because they had found a shape to put the fear into. They saw it from 2 hours' distance on a morning that had started clear and then changed without warning, clouds assembling from a sky that had shown no indication of clouds. The island looked ordinary at first. Scrub and rock, a low central rise, the kind of terrain that the Aegean had reproduced 1,000 times across its scattered self. It was only as they drew closer that the wrongness Telemachus had heard described began to be apparent, not in any specific thing, but in an accumulation of small things that should have been unremarkable. The way the water around the island was too flat, too settled, as though it had given up the practice of waves. The way no birds circled above it. The way the colour of the stone was different from what the sun should have made it, darker than the light warranted, as though the island absorbed illumination rather than reflecting it. They anchored in a small cove on the southern side. Telemachus took Doron and 2 others. He left the remaining 7 with the ship and gave them instructions that were precise and that he delivered without sentiment. If they had not returned in 2 days, sail home. Tell Penelope that her son had gone looking for his father and found the same answer. No one laughed. He had not expected them to. The island's interior smelled of wild thyme and something beneath it, old stone, the particular cold smell of places that stay out of sunlight. They walked for perhaps an hour before they found the first sign of the Cyclops. Enormous footprints in a dried stream bed, each the size of a small boat, filled now with moss and rainwater, ancient looking, as though they had been made in a different era. "Are they still here?" Doron asked quietly. "I don't think so," Telemachus said. "But I don't know." The cave was on the north slope of the central rise, exactly where Polite's account had placed it. Telemachus recognized it the moment it came into view, not from memory, which he had none of, but from the way the description aligned with reality. The height of the opening, the flattened stone in front of it, the broken remains of what might once have been a fence for animals. He stood at the entrance for a long time. The darkness inside was the same darkness Polites had described. Not ordinary darkness, something more committed. He took out the torch they had prepared and lit it. The cave was enormous. He had known it would be from the account, and he had tried to prepare himself for it. But preparation and arrival are different countries. And standing inside the actual space, the actual stone, the actual depth of it, the actual scale of a place built to hold a giant and his flock, was a different experience from imagining it. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness beyond the torchlight. The floor was stone, and something else, something that had once been other things. He didn't look down too closely. The remnants of the sheep pens were still here, partially collapsed, the wooden posts rotted but still standing in their rough arrangement. There were bones, animal bones mostly, large ones, though here and there shapes that were not animal, and he looked at these and looked away and made no comment to the others. At the far end of the cave, there was the wall. He walked to it. The torchlight threw his shadow enormous behind him as he crouched and looked at the stone. And what he saw there was nothing, and also everything. The stone had been struck, once and hard. The mark of the impact was still legible if you knew to look for it, a dark stain in the texture of the rock that the years had not quite erased, that the dampness and the darkness had preserved in amber, the way the cave had preserved all its other evidence of what had happened inside it. He pressed his palm flat against the stone. He stayed that way for a long time. Behind him, Doran and the others waited. They had the patience of men who understand they are witnessing something private and enormous, and who are doing the courtesy of looking elsewhere. When Telemachus finally spoke, his voice was steady. "He made it to this wall," he said. "He was here." He was not talking to the others. It was Doran who found the other thing. He had wandered further into the cave than the rest, drawn by some instinct that he could not have articulated, and his torch found it on a low shelf of rock to the left of the main space. A shelf that would have been at the height of a man's eye if a man had been hiding low against the wall, below the sightline of something enormous. He called Telemachus over without saying what it was. He just held the torch and waited. On the shelf of rock, preserved by the cave's cold and dark, the way things are sometimes preserved against all reason in places the weather doesn't reach, was a knife, bronze handle, carved bone grip. The bronze had gone dark with age, but the form was still there. Telemachus picked it up. It was lighter than he expected. He turned it over in his hands. On the flat of the blade, almost invisible unless the light hit it at the right angle, was a mark. Not a maker's mark, not a name. Something older, something that predated letters, a symbol he had seen before in one place, carved into the lintel of his father's treasury in Ithaca, placed there by Laertes, the grandfather he barely knew. His father had drawn this knife, had held it in that last moment, had, from the position of the shelf, driven it into something. The blade had a nick in it, near the point that could have been metal against stone, but could equally have been something else. And then the hand holding it had struck the shelf, and the knife had remained. Telemachus sat down on the cave floor. He sat with the knife in his hands, and he did not cry. He had expected to feel something large and dramatic, grief, he supposed, or rage, or the particular hollowness that people described as the feeling of understanding something you have spent years trying not to understand. What he felt was smaller than that, more precise. He felt the dimensions of the gap. Not his father's death exactly. The death was a fact, and he had always carried it. What he felt now was the size of the thing that should have existed in the space the death had left. The kingship, the return, the decades of stories, the voice at the dinner table, the lessons he had never received, the knowledge that would have passed between them, the arguments they would have had, the particular inheritance of a son from a father who had seen too much and survived it and brought it home to share. He felt the negative shape of it, the place it should have filled, and he understood for the first time with his whole body, rather than just his mind, what had changed when Polyphemus's hand found the wrong place at the wrong moment. Not just one life, the kingdom without its king, his mother alone in the palace, the suitors in the hall, the ships that no longer sailed far, the god who had withdrawn, the sea that had grown heavier. One moment, one hand, one wrong breath. He could trace the lines from that single point outward across 20 years, like cracks spreading through stone, reaching every corner of the world he had grown up in, the world that was not the world that should have been. He was still sitting when he heard it, not a sound he could locate, not a sound exactly. More a presence, the cave changing its quality around a specific point, the darkness shifting in a way that had nothing to do with any torch. He was on his feet before he had decided to stand, the knife in his hand by instinct. The others were pressed against the wall behind him. "Who's there?" Telemachus said. He had practiced that question his whole life without knowing it. What came was not an answer in words. It was more like a pressure, the sense of an enormous attention turning toward him, focusing, something very old that had been in this cave for a long time, and was now aware of him in a way it had not been a moment before. He held still. He was, in this, more like his father than he knew. That capacity to stay still inside the worst moments, to wait rather than fill the space with noise. The presence, whatever it was, seemed to consider him. Then it withdrew. The cave was only a cave again, stone and dark and dripping water, and the smell of old things. Doron let out a breath. "What was that?" "I don't know," Telemachus said. And then, because it was true and he was too tired for anything else, "I think it was my father's ghost. I think he's been here since the beginning." The others were quiet. "In the cave?" "In the cave," Telemachus said, "because he never got far enough away from it to go anywhere else." He looked around at the stone walls, the deep dark, the remnants of the life that had been lived here in monstrous simplicity. This is where the story stopped, so this is where he stayed. He found her in the garden when he returned. Not in the hall was full of its noise, its daily carnival of appetites, and she had stopped spending time there years ago. She was in the garden that had been hers and his father's, growing things that required no political calculation and made no demands of her that she could not meet. She saw his face and was very still. He sat beside her on the old stone bench. He put the knife on the stone between them. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. "You found it," she said. "He had it at the end," Telemachus said. "He tried." "Of course he did." They sat for a while in the garden, which smelled of rosemary and something else that was her. Olive oil and wool, and the particular scent that his earliest memory associated with safety, however distant that felt now. "The cave," he said finally. "I think he's there. What's left of him?" She closed her eyes. "I know." He looked at her. "You know? I dreamed it 2 years after he died," she said quietly. "I didn't want to know, so I stopped letting myself dream about it." She opened her eyes. They were dry. but I always knew. He thought about the ghost, the presence, the turning attention. He thought about what it would mean to be contained in a cave on a distant island for 20 years, unable to pass through, watching whatever this world had become without the ability to touch it. He would hate it, Telemachus said. Something moved in his mother's face, not quite a smile, but the echo of one, the shape, a smile made in a face that hadn't had occasion to practice the expression in a long time. He would be furious, she said. He would be plotting. Yes. He was always plotting. Yes. They sat. The garden held them. Above the garden, the sky went slowly orange and then red and then the first purple that meant evening. And in the hall behind them, the suitors grew louder, and the noise of the hall was the sound of a world that had arranged itself around an absence the way water arranges itself around a stone, rushing to fill the space, becoming defined by the object that was no longer there. In the years that followed, the scholars of Athens would argue about where the gods were during the long deterioration of Ithaca, and whether divine indifference was the same as divine cruelty, and whether Athena's withdrawal had been a choice or a kind of grief. Poseidon's increased influence was noted in the records. More shipwrecks, more coast-hugging voyages, more abandoned harbours where the deep-sea trade routes had once deposited their abundance. Hermes made no journeys across the Western Sea. There was no one to carry messages to. Calypso waited on her island for a visitor who would never arrive. She waited for 5 years before she understood that she was waiting for a specific man, and another 3 before she understood he was dead. And even then she kept the fires burning at night out of habit or hope, or the particular stubbornness of immortals who have decided on a thing. Zeus watched and did not intervene, which was the thing Zeus did most often, and which the mortals who suffered under it would spend millennia attempting to reconcile with any coherent theology of divine justice. The world moved on. Not well, but it moved. In the original story, there is a bow, a test, a massacre. In this version, there was no massacre. Penelope eventually chose. She chose Eurymachus, the most moderate of them, the one who had occasionally shown her something that resembled respect, and she chose him with clear eyes and no love, and the strategic clarity of a woman who had kept an impossible situation from complete collapse for 20 years, and understood when it was time to accept the lesser catastrophe. The island stabilized. Eurymachus was not cruel. He was not inspiring. He was competent in the limited way of men who have inherited what they never built and know it, who carry the knowledge of their own inadequacy like a stone in the chest that they have learned to breathe around. Telemachus accepted this. He had no good option, and he knew it. He remained in Ithaca, where he was necessary, and managed the parts of the kingdom that Eurymachus was uninterested in managing: the harbour, the farms, the old men in the agora, and did this work quietly and without credit and without complaint, because complaint required an audience he did not have. He kept the knife. He kept it in a box with the letters his father had written to his mother during the war, the ones with the jokes in them that he had finally, after years of trying, learned to recognize. The jokes were small and dry and entirely private, jokes that only made sense between 2 people who had been together long enough to develop their own language. And even at 25, Telemachus could only understand their outline, their shape, not their full interior. He put the box in his father's old study, which he had cleaned and maintained himself, against Eurymachus' casual intention to convert it to a wine storage. He did not go back to the island. Polyphemus lived for a long time after that morning in the cave. The gods had made him slow and enormous and solitary, but they had not made him immortal. And in his final years he sat at the cave mouth in the early evenings and watched the sea go dark, and did not call to the other Cyclops who had long since moved to other parts of the island. He had thought about the small man often, not with guilt. He was not a creature built for guilt, but with a species of curiosity that had never quite resolved itself. The curiosity about a particular quality the man had possessed, a quality Polyphemus had felt in the moment of the wrist, a quality that was not quite courage and not quite intelligence, but something between them and beneath them both, something that had no name in the language of giants. He had found the knife years after, in the cave while moving a rock. He had held it in his enormous hand, the tiny thing, and turned it and set it down again on a low shelf of stone where the light could reach it on certain mornings. He did not know why he left it there. He did not have the language to think about why. In his last year, blind and enormous and very old, Polyphemus heard a boat in the southern cove. He heard small human voices on his island, nervous voices, kept quiet, though not quiet enough for a Cyclops whose other senses had sharpened in the years without sight. He heard them come through the interior. He heard them find the cave. He sat very still at the cave mouth and listened to what they did inside. He heard the boy, and it was a boy's presence, a young man's, though the age was harder to determine without sight. Find the knife. He heard the boy sit down. He felt in the old and imprecise way of creatures who had lived long enough to develop something like a sixth sense for the weight of human sorrow, what was happening in the young man's chest. And he did the only thing he could do, which was nothing. He sat at the cave mouth and let the moment exist around him. Let the young man have whatever he needed from the cave, because the cave held something that was the young man's by inheritance, even if Polyphemus had put it there, and he was too old and too tired to argue about ownership of anything anymore. After they left, Polyphemus sat for a long time in the silence. Then he went inside. He felt his way to the low shelf. The knife was gone. He lowered himself to the cave floor and lay there in the dark that was not dark to him, was never dark to him, not in the way it was dark to others, and listened to the sea, which was doing what the sea does, continuing, indifferent, enormous, full of its own long memory. Somewhere on that sea, a small boat was sailing east. Somewhere on that sea, Poseidon moved, satisfied, through the deep water. Somewhere on Olympus, Athena sat with her owl and her spear and her grief that was not grief, and looked away from the world she had stopped tending, and felt the weight of a single moment, a hand, a wrist, a wrong movement in a dark cave that had knocked the future sideways into something smaller and darker and less than it should have been. She did not look east toward Ithaca. She knew what she would see. She knew the shape of a world that had lost its cleverest man before he could bring his cleverness home. And she knew that she had loved him the way gods love the things that remind them of themselves. And she knew that the love had not been enough to save him, because love is not always the thing that saves. And in the cave, in the dark, in the place where the story had stopped 20 years before, the ghost of Odysseus waited, not angry, past anger, past the hot things, the rage, the striving, the desperate, brilliant scheming that had been the engine of him in life. Only waiting, the way the dead wait, for the moment, if it ever comes. When the living stop needing to understand what happened and begin, finally, to live with the fact of it. When the questions quiet themselves. When the absence becomes simply part of the shape of things, the way a missing stone becomes part of the wall. The cave breathed, the dark held. The sea outside moved in its ancient rhythms, indifferent to kings and gods and clever men. Nobody had killed him, and nobody remembered him the way he had actually been. Quick and warm and full of jokes and not quite heroic in the expected way, not sculptural or grave, just a man with a good mind and a bad habit of winning until the moment he didn't. Nobody had brought him home. And the world, which had needed him badly, had learned, as worlds do, to do without.